Are you lazy like me? Today, I'm going to show you how to build a very simple Node CLI tool, or command line interface tool, that brings the power of AI right into your terminal. I don't know about you, but I've been very frustrated in the past where I'm in a flow and I have to interrupt it to go out and Google some command, or I have to go and Google some boiler code, scanning docs, taking hours. This tool will eliminate all that frustration with the power of AI. Let's take a look at the finished result. So you'll be able to name your tool whatever you want. I named mine I'm lazy to remind myself I'm lazy each time I use it. It has a command called P, and here we can ask life's hard questions like what is the get command for resetting a branch, resetting a branch at a given commit. Now, by the power of AI, it's going to turn my natural language question into an actual get command, get reset hard commit, and this is correct. We're going to add one extra feature to this project that allows us to write to a file. So I'm going to do the same thing. I'm lazy prompt generate an HTML file that has a button that increases a counter by 1 each time you click it. Now we're going to add an optional flag called O for out and name a file. So I'll name index.html. Now the same thing is happening. It's taking my natural language prompt, going out and fetching the HTML based on what we asked it, and it's giving us a little preview here of the HTML that came back. You can see it's an HTML doc with a button that increases count each time you click. Now you can see, additionally, since we added that option, it's written a file called index.html in this directory. And let's take a look at that. You can see that the file contents is the response we got. So how is this working? Under the hood, it is using OpenAI. And if you haven't heard of OpenAI directly, you've probably heard of it indirectly with things like Chat-GPT or DALL-E AI image generation. All of those tools are powered by OpenAI under the hood. The great thing about OpenAI is they've made all of that technology available to you, developers like you and me, via their API, or application programming interface. So we can build cool tools using very powerful AI for free. A side note, this whole project is inspired by a tool called Shell GPT, which is a more advanced version of what we're making today, using Python instead of Node. But if we take a look at the example here, you can see that Shell GPT allows you to do a similar thing. Make a command based off of natural language. This example is asking how to make an ffmpeg command. This is a video editing CLI. And you can see that once it goes out and fetches the result, it allows you to execute that command with a yes or no prompt, which is really cool. By the end of this video today, you'll absolutely be able to make a tool like this, even if you've had little experience with NodeJS or even little experience working with APIs. So let's get started. As I mentioned earlier, we'll be using a programming language called NodeJS to build the CLI tool. You can build CLI tools in many different coding languages, but NodeJS is what we'll use today. Basically, it's JavaScript that you can run outside the browser. So many computers come with Node, but if you aren't sure, go ahead into your terminal and type node-v. If you get back a version, that means you have Node. If you get like command not found, that means you don't have Node and need to go install it. You can go to nodejs.org to install Node for your operating system. And when you do that, you'll also get a package manager that comes with Node called npm, Node Package Manager. So those are the only two prerequisites we need to build what we're building today. All right, so let's get started with the project. You can make a new directory with make dir and name your project. I'm going to call mine I'm lazy. Now we can cd into our project directory and start coding. I use VS Code to write my code, but you can use any text editor that you like. So you see here we have an empty project, and the way we start a Node project is with the command npm init. So I'll type that, and it's going to prompt us a couple things to name our project, give it a default version. You can write a description if you want. You can just press enter to all these and say yes at the end. All right, now let's take a look at what changed. When we use npm init, it writes a file into our project called package.json. And this file has all the metadata about our project. It needs to be here, and it's going to be how we manage our packages that we use later as well. One extra bonus thing, this is totally optional, but if you're ever planning to share this project publicly or use it in a portfolio, you might want to be tracking your changes with Git. So if you have Git and know what it is, you can also git init to start using Git in this project. And while you can't see it in here, this actually creates a hidden folder called Git that will help us track our changes. One last thing to always be careful of when we're using Git is you want a file in your project called .gitignore. And what this is going to do is allow us to type things, files or folders that we don't want to track changes on. So one good practice when you're working with Node is to ignore a folder called Node modules, because this is where all of our packages will live later, and we don't want to push those to GitHub or wherever we're storing our code. So, all right, if you didn't understand any of that, that's fine. Again, the Git step is optional. As long as you have your package.json, you're ready to get started. So the first thing we're going to do is add a file in our project called CLI.js. So you can add a file by saying touch CLI.js. And you can see here we now have an empty JavaScript file. And if you're new to Node, you can output things to the screen with the console log command. So we'll try this one first with a good old yo world. And the way you run Node code is by saying node and then the name of the JavaScript file you want to run. So I'll just press enter, and you can see it's logged yo world to the screen. Congratulations, you've written your first line of code in Node. In order to turn this into an actual CLI or command line interface application, there's a couple of libraries in the JS world that will make writing a CLI tool very simple. One of them is called Yargs. Another is called Commander, which is the one I'd like to show you today because it's very simple to get started making CLI tools. Now, there's a couple options to get started here. Of course, we could go and take a look at the Commander documentation and take a look at some of their code examples to see how we could get started. But in the spirit of playing around with AI, why don't we ask AI to generate some boiler code for us? So you can go ahead and navigate to the OpenAI console and head to the API section, which is where we are, and you can say log in or sign up. It looks pretty similar. I already have an account, so I'm just going to use my Google account to sign in. It is free to get started with OpenAI. You get $18 of credits to start with for free. You don't have to enter any credit card information, and that $18 goes a really long way. I've spent full days of testing out OpenAI and only spent like 2 cents. So you can get pretty far with $18. All right, so we're here, and you can see there's a playground that allows us to type commands and see what comes back. So this is the text completion API. We can write here, generate boiler code for a Node CLI app that uses the Commander library. And we can also tell it to have an example command, so it should have one example command. All right, and we'll say submit. And you can see we're getting a streaming response here of an example program we could write. All right, it even tells us a file name we can use for it. So I'm just going to copy this code. It looks good to me. And we'll head back to our project. And we'll replace our yo world with the code from AI and save. Now let's just take a quick look at this. If you're new to Node, this first line here is how we import the package called Commander. We don't have it yet, but we'll do that in a second. And once we have it, we're saving it to a variable called program. Now we can take program and configure it. We can give it a version number and a description, and we can also add commands to it by saying program.command. And here's the example command called example. The syntax here is interesting. When you define a command, you first name it, and if that command is expecting any arguments, you use the, what's these called? Chevrons? The chevron syntax to name or nickname your arguments. So here they've nicknamed it input, which means that they can use that argument down here and spit it back. So this command here, as we can see, is just example. It has a description, just an example command, and all it does is when we run the command, it's going to spit back the argument that we put in. The very last line in here, program.parse, is where the magic actually happens. Process.argv is actually native to Node, and this is where it picks up all of the arguments after a command. And so here we're wrapping it with program.parse to use the commander library to take whatever the user typed in and run it through this very simplified interface for writing CLI commands. All right, so let's just even try this out. Now, if I actually tried to run this, there's going to be an error. So let's see. Remember how I said node CLI.js is how we'll run a node command? And we get this huge error saying cannot find module commander. That's because we haven't installed it. Now, to install a third-party package in Node is very simple. You just say npm I for install, and make sure you spell the package right, but we're going to get commander. And press enter, it's going to go out and fetch the package commander. Now you'll see here in package.json, we've added a dependency called commander, and this is the version, the latest version that npm found. You'll also notice that when we install a package lock.json file was added to our project automatically. You never have to look in here, but this project is really important, or excuse me, this file is very important for a Node project to understand which dependencies are installed. So don't delete this file, you definitely need it, but also you don't have to look at it. It's just helping your modules resolve and keep them in the right versions. Okay, so now if we run this, it should work. So we can say node CLI.js. Now we aren't adding any arguments. Let's see what happens. So because we didn't add any arguments, Commander is a great library. It assumes that you need some help. You don't know exactly what you're doing here. So it allows us some built-in commands like asking for help or asking for the version. Let's go ahead and try those. So it said we can use the -- version flag to get the version. And it's giving back 1.0.0. And where is this coming from? Well, we defined it right here. So for example, if we called this 2.0.0, saved, and run this again, now you'll see it's 2.0.0. What happens when we try the -h for help? It's giving us the help here. Okay, so let's actually try to run this example command here. To do that, we have to run an argument. The first argument will be the name of our command, which is example, and then we type some input after it. So here we go, node CLI.js, and here we'll type example to start our example command and give it some argument like this is a test arg. And here we see example command with input, this is a test arg, because it's running our action because we defined the command as example. One interesting thing is you see here on the next line, there is an alias assigned to this command. This is just like a nickname, a single character nickname that we can use, or a shortened version of whatever command we have. Because you know coders are lazy and they don't want to type full things out. We can do the exact same thing above, except instead of typing out example, since we have an alias called E defined for this command, just type E and we get the same thing back. Great, so we've written our first command in NodeJS using the commander library. The next step is, instead of just, outputting some, echoing back what the user put in, we're going to actually send a request to OpenAI's API to get back a response. All right, so let's get ready for that. I don't like the name here, example. That's not what we're going to be calling it. How about prompt? Because we're going to be prompting the AI. And here we can even, call this prompt. All right, and we'll give it the alias P, which is short for prompt. And what does it do? We'll say that generates an OpenAI response for any given text prompt. That's the description for this command. And the action, what should happen? Well, for now, we can just echo back your prompt. And we'll rename input to prompt as well, just to be clear about what we're working on. The name doesn't matter so much. It's just helping us as humans read this. And while we're at it, we can just rename, we'll put the version back to 1 and give a description for our app itself, which is a Node CLI for generating responses from OpenAI's API. Okay, so this is going to do pretty much the same thing we had seen before, except now we'll say P for prompt and give it some prompt, like foo. And it says our prompt is foo. So the next step is going to be sending that prompt off to OpenAI. Okay, so you already have logged in to OpenAI if you've been following along. If not, go to openai.com, head to the API section, create an account for free, and you're going to end up somewhere like here. This is the home screen. And just to give you a little preview of what it looks like inside, you'll be able to manage your account by clicking on your profile up here, and you can see what type of usage you have. If you have a new account, this is probably empty, but as you can see, I've been playing with it a lot. And like I mentioned earlier, I have been using OpenAI a lot in the last couple of days and have only used maximum 20 cents in any given day. So you can see that $18 will take you a long way. I did jump the gun and ended up buying OpenAI because I think it's a really useful tool. But again, you don't have to buy anything to build out this project. Okay, so we're going to be, you could use the documentation here that has an API reference showing you, how to get started with this API, how to make requests, and specific endpoints. For example, we're going to be working with the text completion endpoint, which you can see is a post request to this endpoint, and it gives you an example of what types of data you can put in the body. Documentation is great, but I'd like to introduce to you a tool called Postman that makes working with APIs very simple. Quick disclaimer, I do work at Postman, but I would be using Postman even if I didn't work there because I was using it from before then as well. But Postman is also a free tool. You can just go to postman.com. If you don't have a Postman account, you can create one for free. And the cool thing is you don't have to download an app. You can use Postman right from the browser. So this is the view you'll get if you've made a Postman account and you go to postman.com, you're already in the tool. Now, there's a lot you can do with Postman, but one of the cool things is there's an API network where you can search for APIs and people have documented them for you and you can just copy them and get started. So let's go ahead and search for OpenAI. And you got to use your own discretion here because anybody can publish an OpenAI workspace or collection. I like to trust anything with Postman in the title because it's made by the Postman team. So here we see there's an OpenAI workspace made by the Postman DevRel team. So I'll just click to teleport in there. I can see some other people are also looking at it right now. And just to show you what the UI looks like, Postman organizes API requests into something called a collection. And in this panel, you can see all the collections. There's one in here called OpenAI. I can open it up and there's requests that are organized into folders based on the different endpoints in our OpenAI API. So for example, if you wanted to do image generation, you can see what an image generation request would look like. It's a post request to this URL with this endpoint, and here's an example body. We're going to be working with the text completion endpoint, which is a post request to /completions, and it gives you an example body here. Now, I can't just click here and send because this is a public collection, or excuse me, workspace. That's what you can see, the globe icon is up here. Meaning I can't be editing this, other people need to reference it too, but I can easily make a fork or create my own copy. So I'll click these three dots and say create a fork, and I can name it whatever I want. I'll just fork it into the default workspace I get, my private workspace called my workspace. You can also create a custom workspace if you want. I'm going to uncheck watch original collection because that means anytime someone at Postman changes this, it's going to give me an email and saying that it's updated. If you want that, for sure, keep that checked, but I get too many emails, so I'll keep it at a minimum. But now that we've clicked create fork, it's teleported us to the workspace we chose as our destination workspace and given us a copy of the OpenAI collection. Now you can see, if I click on the create completion request, the send button is available to me, and the body example is here. Now, what happens if I try to just send this raw right now? I'll get rid of that. We get a 401 unauthorized response from the API. And this is actually a good thing. OpenAI's API is protected with authorization. That is to prevent abuse, because if it was open to anyone, thousands of API calls a second, somebody can code and like bring the whole thing down. People could abuse it for illegal use. So what we do need to get is an API key. And based on the documentation or even the instructions here in Postman, I think if you take a look here, it shows you that you can authorize your request with a bearer token, which we can get from the API OpenAI dashboard. And so here we see there's a token, but right now we have no value for it. Now, whenever you see these double curly braces in Postman, this represents a variable name. And as we're going to learn, tokens are something very sensitive. You don't want to share your token with the whole wide world on the internet because somebody else can see it, they can steal it and make requests on your behalf, meaning they could use up all of your credits, your $18 credits, or if you're paying like me, they could charge you thousands of dollars a month if you don't have a cap on it. So treat your API keys and tokens like your password on your computer. You do not want to share them. And Postman helps us out here by helping us keep that secret. So we can use a variable here in the variables tab, and we could call it token. And what I want to do, I'll get rid of this to make some space, is provide my token here in the current value column only. The reason there's two columns here in Postman is if I wanted to share my fork collection with a friend or with another developer, they're going to see all of these initial values when they copy my collection or if they view my collection in a public workspace. But anything in current value is hidden. It's private to me, and that's where I'll put my token. Okay, so how do we get the token? And there's a little note down here about why it's a sensitive value we should protect. We'll go back to the OpenAI website and head into our account. I believe there's an API keys section here. I already have two generated, but I'm going to create a new one for the purpose of this video by saying create new key. And here it is. Here's my long key. I'll just click copy. This is the only time you'll be able to view your key. So make sure you copy it right now. Say okay. You'll never be able to see the full key again. And for those of you that saw it on my screen, don't even try to steal my API key because by the time this video is up, I will have deleted it. You can't take any freebies off me. All right, so I have my key in my clipboard. I'll head back to Postman and I will paste my key right here in token and save by pressing Command S or Control S. So now you can see because we have authorization set on our collection, it's going to apply this authorization to all of the requests and anything beneath. As you see now, token turned orange because we provided a value for it, and you can see the current value is the token we just pasted, meaning if I try to send this request again, the prompt here is say this is a test, we'll send, and we should get back a response this time. Yeah. So it gives us some metadata about like what type of model was used to generate the response. It gave us a pretty bad response here. It's just a period. We could try another test in here. So like, again, we could say like generate a git command for setting a new remote. And I'll send. And man, this model is not very good. We should, let's see, play around a little bit. Oh, okay, so there's a couple of parameters we get in here. For those of you new to using the OpenAI API, a great way to learn what these parameters mean is to head over to the playground And you can see those parameters are listed on the right here. Now, first things first, DaVinci has a couple of different models. The model by default in the Postman collection is just DaVinci, but we can get the latest model, which is the most advanced, by saying text DaVinci 003. That is the model seen here. The temperature. This is how, kind of introducing how much randomness is involved in the response. So if your temperature is at 0, it means you're going to more likely get the same response back each time you ask the same question to OpenAI. It defaults here to 0.7. So we could, I like 0.7 because I like getting different answers each time I ask AI. So we can go ahead and set that here in the temperature, 0.07 or 0.7. Now tokens. The way OpenAI works is it divides all of the text. So here, this is some sample text. And tell me a story. And if I hit submit, you can see that there were 10 tokens in our prompt. And it's going to also return a certain number of tokens as well. Right now, we have our maximum token length set to 256. Now, a token is not a one-for-one with the word count. Tokens are more conceptual, so there's some rough guides you can look up online about how to calculate tokens. Essentially, a one paragraph of text in English, depending on the paragraph size, can be about 100 tokens. Right now, we have a very low token limit set on our Postman request. So instead of 7, let's just bump this up to, 500. And now we'll send the same question, generate a GET command, send back. And we still aren't getting a very good answer. This, I think is their stop sequence. This is something that will tell the AI, hey, stop generating the response once you hit this substring. That's been baked into this Postman request, but I think we should just get rid of it. What I've noticed is the AI generates a lot of new lines, even like before the prompt starts, which is why ours were getting cut off earlier. So I got rid of the stop. I've changed temperature to 0.7. Again, temperature means the amount of randomness that is included in the response. I like to get different answers each time I ask AI, so I can kind of ask it a couple times and compare answers. So I'll put it at 0.7, which is the default on the playground. And max, there's calculators out there if you'd like to try, but let's try getting the GET command for setting a new remote with these new properties. And we can see we're getting a couple new lines in the beginning, but it says get remote, add remote name, remote URL here in the first choices that came back. So great, we're now able to make a request. We've poked around with it a bit in Postman. You can try editing the prompt, see what comes back, adjusting these tokens, counts and stuff a little bit to see exactly how you'd like to use it for your project. That's why Postman is great for poking around. Another reason it's great, is over here, there's a code tab that shows us how to generate this request we've built as code. And for example, here in the dropdown, we can pick the language that we're using, which is Node. There's a couple of HTTP libraries for making calls to an API in Node. One of them, there's like a native request library, or there's a native HTTP library, but I prefer to use Axios because it's got a very simple syntax. We'll be learning how to use that to make API calls in our project. So here, if I click on this, you can see there's a very long-winded example of how to write an Axios code. So just know that that's there, but I'm again going to show you how to do this stuff with AI because I prefer to use that today. So let's remember in our project, we're trying to turn this prompt and send it just like we do send a prompt here to the OpenAI API. All right, so to get started here, this is my preference, but I like to make a new file for all of my API call stuff. So I'm going to make a new directory actually inside my project called library. And inside the library folder, I'm going to make a file called OpenAI.js. And here's where all of our calls to OpenAI will live. So if I open up the lib folder and see OpenAI.js, I'm going to make an object called OpenAI. Here's how we make an object. And the properties of the object will be the types of commands we can make. So we want to make a completion command, right, for text completion. So I'll give it a key completion, and the value will be a function. Now this is the syntax for writing a function in JavaScript. And here we want to take an argument that is the prompt, right? And we're going to be sending that to the OpenAI API. All right, so in here we have to do two things. We have to call the OpenAI API, and of course we have to return the response so that we can use it. So again, how are we going to call the OpenAI API? I told you about a library called Axios. So we can search for it here and do the traditional thing of looking up the documentation. All of that is documented here. How to install, we'll be doing that as well. Some basic syntax for how to make a request. Or we can just go back to the playground and just say like generate a basic API call in Axios. We're going to be making a post request, right? It should be a post request with authorization headers. And we'll just see what it comes out with here. Submit. So clearly we need to get the library Axios by requiring it. And it's showing us we can make a post request with axios.post, some endpoint, and we can pass some data in there and some headers. Now it's also adding some then and catch, like what we should do with the response. We'll deal with this a little bit later. But first, we don't want to just be able to make the request at all. So let's go back to our code. I'll copy up into here and head back into our project. In the OpenAI.js file, I'll paste this down here for reference. I want to take our import and put it at the top of our file. And in our completion action object, I'm going to put this right here. So since we have the Axios object, we can use the .post method to hit some URL with some data and headers. This is all a little bit spaced out, but I'm going to reconfigure this a little bit. First things first is, yes, we can use post and some URL. I prefer just to use the generic request method, and then we can use options parameters to define our request method, our request URL, everything inside. So I'm actually going to delete all this and just show you the simpler way to do it. And here we can say we're going to pass options into our request. But of course, first we have to define those options. So, oops, options is this. We need the URL. It's going to be something. We need a method. We know that it's a post request, and we can say lowercase post. We need, in our case, we're going to be passing, from here in Postman, we're going to be passing a body. So in Axios, we call that the data object, and we'll put some object here. And lastly, we're going to have to pass some authorization headers. So there's going to be some headers that we are going to pass. So all of this is needing to be filled out. First things first, what is the URL that we're trying to hit? Well, if we take a look at Postman, we can see the base URL is this. Can't copy that. There we go. And /completions is the URL we're heading for. So I'm going to paste that in here. /completions. This is the API endpoint. We're going to be making a post request, and the data we're passing is going to look something like this. So I'll even copy this from Postman and paste it in here. Now, we don't want to send the prompt that's hard-coded. The whole point of this function is to use the prompt that we pass it and pass it into our data object. In JavaScript, this is a shortcut for writing prompt, like passing the prompt into here. You can just say prompt, and it is the same thing as saying prompt. Okay? And we'll say max tokens is 500 by default. We'll do temperature 0.7 by default. I believe n is like the number of responses that come back in that choices array. Stream false is good for us because when stream is true, that's what we see here, where it was like typing it line by line as a stream response. But in our case, we want to just get the whole response back in one chunk. So we'll say stream false. And I'm not sure what log probs is. I'm even going to get rid of it just to be simple. And all right, so headers. Here we need to add the authorization. And if we take a look, we used Postman's authorization helper on the collection level before to pass our API token in. But if you look at the console down here, you can see what actually happens when we make the post request by opening up the request. And you can see here in the request headers, when we made our last request, it added a property called authorization with the value bearer, and this is familiar. This is my OpenAI API key. So we want to follow the same format. I'll just copy authorization and head back to our project. And we'll use quotes because there's a capital letter in here. Authorization, and it starts with bearer. Now in JavaScript, we can interpolate a string by, instead of using double or single quotes, using backticks. Once we started using backticks to identify a string, we can use the $, curly braces syntax to inject some variable. So here we want to inject our API key, which we haven't defined yet. Now, we could just hard code our API key in here, but there's a couple of problems you could foresee. One is if you wanted to share your code, anyone who sees your code can see your API key. Another is you're stuck with using that API key. Let's say that you deactivate the API key, you need to change it. You'd have to actually come in and change the code. Instead, we'll define our API key separately. So I'll do it up here for now. We will hard code it just for an example. I'll copy my API key again from here and paste it right here. Okay. Now we have everything set up that we need. We got the API key auth, we have the data, we have what method and the URL, and we're making the request to Axios. The only thing we're missing here is returning the response. So let's actually just add a return statement here. All right, here we go. So we now have an object called OpenAI with one property, which is a function called completion that will take a prompt and send our prompt to Axios to get the response. Or excuse me, send it to OpenAI using Axios. Now, in order to use this OpenAI object in another file, we'll have to say module.exports equals, and whoops, we'll paste OpenAI right here. This now exposes our object to be imported in other files. So for example, we can go back to CLI.js, and up here, right beneath our commander, say const, we can OpenAI, we'll be plucking it out of the file, equals require, and we'll say // for this directory. Remember, it's in lib, and OpenAI is where our export lived. And we can now use that down here. So OpenAI.completion, which is the name of our method, and we're going to pass in our prompt from the arguments. Now, a couple of things. Remember, this is an asynchronous operation, meaning it takes some time to call an API, and unless we tell JavaScript to wait for the response, it's just going to fire off a request, and your program's going to end before the response comes back. So in JavaScript, we can use the async await syntax to tell our program, like, hey, stop on this line until the response comes back, and I explicitly don't want you to continue. So in order to tell JavaScript this is an asynchronous function, right before your arguments here, you just give the keyword async. You can see it turn blue there. And here we can say await to await the response. Now, we aren't doing anything with the response at this point. We have no way of seeing what it is. So I'm just going to save the response to a variable called res for now, and then we can log the response. Okay. One more thing we forgot is we aren't importing we are importing the Axios library, but we haven't installed it in our project. So do you remember how we install packages? It's npm install Axios. Make sure you spell things correctly, otherwise you're going to download some package that might be one letter off and could be a virus, so be careful. All right, so we've now installed Axios. You can see it's here in our dependencies, meaning our program will know what we mean when we say require Axios. Let's try this out. So let's see. We're going to say node CLI.js, and here we can use our command, which is p, to write some prompt. So we can say like generate a git command for saving a commit. I hope you know this one, but I'll press enter, and we can see it took a second for this huge object to come back. Now, what is this object? This is actually from the Axios library, giving us this whole huge object representing the response from the API. This has a ton of metadata that could be useful to us, such as the status. This was a status 200, successful response. It tells you what headers came back from the API, if this is interesting to you. It tells you all sorts of stuff about the response. What we're probably curious about is this data section of the response, right? Because this is what we actually see coming back here in Postman. If we look at the example request that we did earlier, the body data here is what we're seeing in the response.data object here, right? So let's actually try to log that instead as we drill down into what we're trying to get back from the API. I'll send this request one more time. And now we see just the data object coming back, which is great. This still is not very human readable, because what we actually want is inside of the choices array, there's one object that has the text value of the response. So here's the response from OpenAI. That's what we want to expose. So here, I'm just going to make a new variable called text, and we're just going to drill down into our response. So we'll say response.data, and then you can see its choices, and we get the first object in the array and get the text. All right, and so we'll log the text response this time and try this again. Cool, so now we get the prompt and then the response down here. Great, there's a couple of things you might have noticed. There's like these \n. I've noticed a lot of times when we make a text completion request to OpenAI, it gives you some white space that we don't really need. In JavaScript, you can get rid of leading and trailing white spaces with the .trim method. So we're going to go ahead and trim that and send this again. Now we shouldn't see so much white space in between. There we go. And maybe we could do a couple more nice things for our user. One, we don't have to repeat the prompt back to them, so I'll get rid of that. Here, when we're making our request, we could even log and let them know prompting, so that, especially if the response takes a little while to come back, they know that the program isn't, it's actually still waiting for the response. So for example, let's try this again. So now we get this message prompting and then the response down here. Cool. All right, so getting better. One more thing we have to be careful about with working with APIs. Right now, everything is working fine, but this is like a sunny scenario. We're getting a good, successful response from the API. That isn't always going to happen. So for example, let's say we gave it a bad API key. Oops. Here, I'll copy this line, and we'll give it an empty API key, for example. This, as we tried out in Postman earlier, we know this should be a 401 error that comes back. So let's try this. And now we're getting this huge error response that's not very user-friendly. Great thing about Axios is if you're not getting a 200 level response, it's going to throw an error. But the problem is, unless we try and handle that error, it's going to be a mess like this. So how do we handle errors? We can use this try-catch syntax in JavaScript. It looks like this. We say try something. If an error happens, catch that error and do something with the error. So for example, we can log the error, and we'll move all of this into the try block, because this is what we're trying to do. And so here's what happens. It's going to attempt or try to call OpenAI, and then, If that goes fine, it's going to go to this next line and get the text and spit it out on the screen. However, if there's some error in this line, it's going to catch the error here and log it to the screen. One more thing we should do in a Node application is exit the program with a code of 1. In a CLI program, if a program ends in success, it's just going to be an exit code 0, but if it ends in error, it's exit code 1. So this is a way we can make sure our program ends safely with a error exit code. Okay, so that's it so far. Let's try this one more time. And now we'll see it's a bit more of an easy to read. Well, we'll start getting back the whole error object here. You could say a message here, like something went wrong when calling the API. And now that's the method here, right? Or excuse me, the string we get back. Now let's get our API key back to normal. That was just to demonstrate how to handle errors. Here we go. Now we're actually getting the response back from OpenAI. So far so good, except for one thing. We do want to hide our API key. Right now, it's hard-coded right here in our code base, and that means if I push this code to GitHub, someone can steal my API key and start making calls on my behalf, racking up my credit card. I guarantee you there are lots of bots out there scanning GitHub for API keys, especially OpenAI. So let's make sure to hide this. And one way we can do that is by making a special file where we can store our secrets. We can do that in Node by making conventionally what's called a .env file for environment. So I'm going to make that in my project directory. You can see that it's added here. One quick note is anything we put in this file, we want to be secret. So I did, when I paused the video, I added .env in here. And you see when I do that, it grays out this file, just like Node modules, meaning it's ignored from Git tracking. If you're using Git, or if you plan to publish any code to the internet, make sure that you're not uploading this .env file. You can do that by ignoring it in Git here with .env. All right, so how this works is we just store any of our secrets as key value pairs. So for example, we want one called API key, and put an equal sign for whatever our API key value will be. We'll grab that from our OpenAI file, cut, and paste. We don't need quotes in here. Now, because this won't be uploaded to GitHub if I were to share my code, if someone else wanted to clone my project and try it locally themselves, they might not know that they need an API key variable. So one common code etiquette here is when you have a secret .env file, to make a public version of it as like a .env.example. And this one we will track, and I'll just copy the variable that we need. Not the value, by the way, just the key. And now, if someone comes to my code base, they see, oh, I need to supply an API key in a .env file. And this will also be helpful to you in the future if you're working on your project later and forgot that, oh, I need an API key. This is a great reminder. All right, so how do we now get this value in our code? Node has a special library called .env. So I'll say npm install .env. This will allow us to detect env files and the key value pairs inside of them. What I like to do in my projects is make like a config file, config.js, at the root of my project. And here's where I'm going to make like a config object, and then we'll export it. So in Node, that's module.exports equals, and I'll name it config. So in order to access the environment variables, we're going to require the, oh man, having a bit of a autocomplete issue today. So we're going to, require .env, there we go, and we say .config. And by default, it's going to look for a file in this directory called .env, because that's the convention in Node.js, to slurp up those key value pairs. Now, we can access those. So I could say const API key equals, using Node's native process.env, which checks for any environment variables. Since we've configured our .env library, it's aware of the key value pairs in .env. So I can just say .api key here, and it's going to slurp it up from that file. And I'm going to expose a property called API key with the value of the API key that we just took from the environment. We can even simplify this by doing this. How about that's a bit cleaner. Okay, so now if I import this config object into another file, I'll be able to get the API key property based on our API key value in our .env file, which is what we want to do in our in here. So let's import our config. So const config equals require / actually it's one folder up from lib, so config. And one important thing here is because we exported our config with curly braces, we also need to import it with curly braces. Okay. And now our API key value is going to be config.api key. Whoa. Here. And again, we can probably make this cleaner just by cutting and pasting down here. All right, so this should still work. Let's just double check that when we run node CLI.js that we get the prompt and the response. Awesome. So everything is all hooked up, and we have successfully hidden our API key such that if we pushed our code to GitHub, it wouldn't be publicized. And we've also told other coders, like, hey, you need to add an API key here. So great, we're off to a solid start. The very last thing we're going to do with our command is add an option to write stuff to a file. Now, we could already do this, actually. Like, if I said node blah, 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 we can use the terminal command of a write chevron and name some file like out.txt. And it's going to pipe whatever comes back from our CLI tool into a file. You see it's like silent now because we're writing into a file. But if we look at the files in here, it's created one called out.txt. And I can take a look, and you can see that it's logged everything that we console logged into this file, which is cool, but we don't really need all of this extra stuff like the prompting, and that's not going to be helpful to us. So instead, we could programmatically use native Node methods to write a file instead of using this chevron. I'll delete this out.txt file here. And we can use a library in Node called write file sync. Now, I always have to look up the documentation for this, so this is a great example of let's use AI. So let's say generate Node code for writing data to a file. Please help us, AI. Send this off. All right, so it says we need the file system library. This is native to Node. We don't have to download a package. We have to have some data, and then we just use the fs write file method and do this stuff. Now, one thing to note is write file is a asynchronous operation. Node has a synchronous version. Remember, it will wait for the file to actually be written, called write file sync. So let's actually get the synchronous version. That's what we want. So it's pretty much the same, but this is it. So, all right. Again, let's go back to our code, and we'll add one file in our library folder called write data to file.js. And I'm just going to copy we should copy the whole thing here. AI gave us. We don't have to go and install fs because it's baked into Node. This stands for file system. It allows us to do these file system-based operations. Now, what we want to do in here is actually make a function called write data to file. Write data to file. And remember, this is the function syntax in JavaScript. First, we need some data, and we need a file name as well. I'm just going to move all this in here. Whoops. Where'd it go? All right, so we don't need to define data that's going to come from outside, and we also need the file name as a parameter, right? So we'll just replace sample with file name, and this is it. Let's export this. Module.exports equals blah, blah, blah. Okay. And we'll go back to our CLI tool. And where are we going to put that? So by default, we don't want to write files unless like the user asked to do it. And that's a great use case for what's called an option flag in CLI tool speak. Now, so far, all we've added in our CLI tool is a command that has a nickname or an alias called p, and we just tell it what to do with that. But we can also add options to our CLI tool. And to do that, let's ask AI again. So generate boiler code for a Node CLI app that uses the commander library and has one command with one example option flag. Okay, submit, tell us what to do. So we already have all this. So we've got a command and a description. So you can add an option flag. This is an interesting example because it's just adding a global option, but we can use this dot option syntax right inside of our specific command. So I'll copy that line and go back to our to our CLI. And how about beneath the description, we just add this option. And here, there's an interesting syntax. The first argument is the name of the option, and it's separated by a comma. So this is very similar to what we have with the command name and alias up here. We can make an alias and an option name. The dash dash is like the long version of the name, and the short dash is the nickname or the alias. So in our case, we want to make an option called out for like output, and O is a fine nickname for that. And we can give a description for this option, which is write the output to a file. Okay, so far we only have the prompt, which is from here, but we can also get the options object back by the second parameter in our action. So for example, let's just try this. We're going to stop calling the API for a second. I'll comment that out. And instead, we're going to just log whatever options come back from our command. So here, we're going to make our command p and then some prompt, but we're going to add the dash o, which is the same thing as saying dash dash out, because we named it that. But I'll say dash o, and whatever we put after the o here is going to be something, right? So I'll type something, and you can see that it has it's marking true for the flag of O. Let's see if we make something with quotes real quick. Interesting. How do we actually get the value of the option is the question. Let me double check my notes. All right, so by default, just like up here, we had a command that took an argument because we told it, hey, here's our argument. Right now, this is just a Boolean flag, meaning because we've specified no argument, it's just going to say true or false whether the O is present. So regardless of whether or not we have something there, you can say it's true there, but if we had no O, it's going to say false or empty, right? So what we need to do is actually add the out argument here, and we give it a name so that this time, if we say dash O and then something, now we're actually getting the value back. Great, now we are able to get our file name as the property here. For example, I could say I want the file name to be index.html, and it's going to give us this property out index.html. So we can access that in here. We're going to uncomment this code so we do call the API. And the only thing we want to change down here is if there is the option flag set. So we can check that by saying options.out. By default, in JavaScript, if something is truthy, for example, if there's a value for out, it's going to resolve that as true in the if statement. Just to be double safe, though, I like to use 2 exclamation points, which will force this to be a Boolean. So this basically means if there's an out property present on our options object, then that means that this user wants to write something to a file. So we will use our write file sync. We will say write data to file. This is the function we made. Since I imported it with the enter statement, it went ahead and automatically required it from our library file up here, which is great. Now, if you remember, we can hover on this here, and it says it takes two parameters, data and file name. So what we want to write here is the text from our response here, and we want to write it to the file name of options.out. All right, so this should be all we have to do to write data to a file. And let's try it. And we should expect, here's a sample of what came back, but we should now also see an index.html file in here with that message here. So again, this is it. Like, this is how easy it is to make a CLI tool to call an API via code. You've learned a lot of the awesome basics of how you write a command, how you nickname it. You can add a description to it, which will show up in the help options. And you can even add optional parameter flags and do things with them based on whether they're present or not. You've also learned how to write data to a file. And most importantly, you've learned how to use AI to help speed up your development. Now, the very last thing I'm going to show you is how to make this a command you can use anywhere on your computer. Because right now, we're in our I'm Lazy project and having to type node CLI.js, blah, 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 the P, and like lots of stuff to even run our project. But we want to be able to just go to any folder in our computer and say I'm lazy P, blah, 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 to run our program. Right now, we can't, right? There's like no command found. So we can easily make our command global on our computer using a method or a command in npm called npm link. And while I'm in my project folder, if I just type npm link, it's going to make a global symlink to this folder on our computer in another global. So we have a symlink to our current project here. We have a symlink now to our project, meaning that you can we'll be able to use a command to access it. But first we have to set up a couple things in our project for it to work. One is in the CLI.js file at the very top, we have to add a special line that's pound bang and -user -bin -env node. Now this is called a shebang statement, and basically this is ignored in Windows, but it's required in like Mac and Unix systems to inform, you know, whatever is executing this file that this is a node executable file. Now you don't have to understand exactly how this works, it's just required to be there, so make sure it's at the top of your file. And one more thing we have to change is in package.json. We have to add a binary or a bin property down here. And this is going to be what we call our program to execute it. So basically, I've given it the name I'm lazy. You can call yours whatever you want. And we have to set a point to the entry file here. So I'm going to say // for this directory, cli.js. So this means when we run the I'm lazy command anywhere on our computer, it's nicknaming to like node execute this file. The very last thing we have to do is to make our cli.js file executable. And I don't actually remember the syntax for that, so I'm going to ask AI. So what is the Unix command for making a file executable? I know it has like a -x in it. It's like chmod. Yeah, okay. Great. I'll just copy this. And we want to make sure that the cli.js file is executable. So bam, it is. You can see that it's executable here because it has executables now. Okay, and that's it. So basically, if I type I'm lazy, it's still not finding the command. So let's see what's up. Maybe we have to npm link it again now that we've added the bin and I'm lazy. Yeah, okay. So I guess npm link we have to do after we add the bin in package.json here. All right, so let's try this out. Let's go to a different folder now. I'll go up a folder and we'll make a new directory in here called sandbox. We'll cd into our sandbox. And let's try out a program. So I'm saying I'm lazy p. It's like, what is the syntax or the Unix command for making a file executable? And we'll prompt it. It's prompting, and something went wrong when calling the API. So good thing we tested this. I know what went wrong. Basically, right now, we're using the global I'm lazy, which is stored in another folder on our computer. What we have to do is make sure that the .n config knows to point to this .env file. Because right now it's looking for .env in that other folder where we're symlinking our I'm lazy. So to do that, all we have to do is just, instead of making it assume the configure path, we have to just tell it explicitly that we want the path to be __ dir name. This is like the project directory that this file is in. And we'll just add explicitly, we want the .env path added here. All right, so let's try this again. Now that I saved our changes, I'm in a different folder, prompting, bam, it's working. So those are the steps to make your CLI tool executable anywhere on your computer. Just to review, we went into our CLI.js file and added the shebang node executable line here. In package.json, we added the binary, I'm lazy, or the name for executing our program, and what the entry file should be. We also updated the path to be hard-coded to relative to this particular project folder. And we, of course, made our file executable, our CLI.js file executable using chmod +x. Whew, all right, so now you know how to do a lot of stuff. You know how to make a CLI tool. You know how to call an API with code. You know how to work with the OpenAI API. For further exploration, I very much encourage you to extend on this project. Just some examples of things you might be able to do. You could make another command, and the way you make a new command is just by making another command down here, like this. And let's say you wanted to make a command called like summarize, and you would get like some file path here. You could make a program that, summarizes files using OpenAI. You could make a program that generates images from a prompt and saves them to the computer. You could add extra option flags on your request to tweak some of the parameters we have in here. For example, you could have an option flag that lets you set the max tokens if you want to have less or more. There's so much you can do. And you can even just try coding this entire thing in a different coding language. Feel free to look at the Shell GPT project as an example. They have some really great things to learn just by checking out their code, or even getting inspired to add some functionality to your app. The possibilities are endless. One last note is, now that you are pros at making API calls in code using the Axios library like we did here, I'm happy to tell you that a lot of APIs out there make it even easier for you to call their API with code using something called an SDK, or software development kit. OpenAI does have two SDKs, I believe, one for Python and one for NodeJS. So if you wanted to refactor your code, here's an example of what this request would be in Node.js using their OpenAI SDK. You could install a package called OpenAI, and basically it's just a wrapper around making an API call with Axios. Actually, if you look at the OpenAI library in GitHub, you can see that they are using Axios under the hood to run this SDK. But basically, all you would do is say OpenAI.create completion and pass it these parameters that we have here. So it's just a bit more of a concise way of coding what we've written in here. But honestly, especially if we're just making one type of API call, I prefer to just either use Axios or the native HTTPS library in Node.js, because then you don't download all of the additional functionality you don't need. It just helps you keep your project a bit leaner. All right. So I'd love to hear what you make with this. Let me know if you've added any functionality in the comments, things that might inspire other people to push themselves to learn a bit more. If you enjoyed what you saw here with Postman, this is a great way to find APIs even to use in your projects. For example, we did find the OpenAI and now have all of these endpoints that we can play with in our applications. I'll also point out there's an Explore tab up here, where if you aren't even really sure which API you want to use with your projects, you can just click on like the Categories tab and find various APIs based on their domain. So, for example, you can go to communication. You can find APIs for sending text messages, for sending messages to Slack. Really, the world is at your fingertips as a developer when you have access to APIs, and now you know how to incorporate them into a command line application. So do share what you build in the comments, and if you're curious to learn more about APIs in Postman, I do recommend checking out the Postman student programs. We have a free training. I'll link in the video description. For anyone that's interested in APIs or Postman, you can take the student expert training here. And it's a self-paced training that is free. At the end of it, you'll do some hands-on activities in Postman and get certified as a Postman student expert with a badge similar to this that you can share on your LinkedIn and show employers that you know how to work with APIs. So that's just my little spiel. And thank you for sticking around. And again, I'd love to see what you make.